Hello. Hi, everyone. Thumbs up if you can hear me. Great. Thank you. Welcome and thank you for being here on day 1, week 2 of COP29 in Baku. I'm Amy Fairbairn. I am the Global Communications Director and Communications and Policy Director of Client Earth, a legal environmental organization. We're here to talk about framework climate laws today, how they are vital to operationalizing the NDCs and holding governments to account at a domestic level, and also enshrining the targets of the NDCs into law so that they sit above day-to-day politics. On Friday, Globe, WWF and Client Earth released a joint statement about the role of framework climate laws in ensuring action of robust NDCs. Some framework climate laws do exist, but many don't, and many just don't go far enough. So what do we need from the next generation of framework climate laws so that ambitions of NDC commitments can be realized? So we have an esteemed panel here with us today. We have Manuel Pulgar Vidal, WWF Global Climate and Energy Lead. We have Gizem Koch, lawyer, Client Earth. We have Marlene Mehra, Globe CEO, and we have Annabella Rosenberg, Senior Advisor, Climate Action Network. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We've got some questions for the panel, and then I'm going to come to the audience for questions too. I'm going to ask the panel to be succinct as they can so that we can cover as much ground as possible. We will also be saying goodbye to Manuel after your interjection in the beginning, and we'll be saying hello to Shirley Matheson, who is the Global NDC Enhancement Coordinator at WWF. So I'm going to pass over to Manuel first to set the scene about NDCs and NDCs 3.0. Why are they important? Why now? What are they? Manuel, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Let me start by saying that we have to make the NDC 3.0 something that we hope is not similar to what happened in between iPhone 14 and 15. There were no difference. The idea is to make the difference. So let me share this introductory, let me share some reflections in these opening remarks to this session. I am a lawyer by training, so probably I will bring some of my background as a lawyer. I know that probably you are not all lawyers, but give me that flexibility to talk as a lawyer. For sure, after that, I will send to you my honorarium fees. No, I'm just kidding. So let me share some reflections around the law, the climate framework law, and the NDCs that I hope can be useful then for the panel. And I have different levels in which I will move my reflections. First, in the global arena. Look, friends, when we go back just to see how much we have progressed in environmental and climate laws, I think that we had a really, really key moment, a milestone in Rio 92. And Rio 92, and mostly because of the Rio Declaration, that it was mostly a statement, and it was for sure a non-legally binding one. But for some reasons, that non-legally binding statement, the Rio Declaration, was able to percolate in most of laws around the world. So probably it has historically been the most important instrument to promote, to lever more environmental law around the countries. Why I am saying this? Because to promote environmental laws in the domestic level, it is not that we do need to have necessarily legally binding things. Sometimes it could be non-legally binding, it could be kind of instrument, it could be the cover decision of a climate COP, so that in the global arena or global level. Then when we move into the domestic level, I am wondering what are we referring to? To the most formal law based in a parliamentary system that it is enacting that category called law, or it is that we can move in different categories. That means from the parliament, or that it could mean the top regulation for the executive branch, because I think that both levels, even the local level, matters. The point is that we are thinking in a broader concept of law. For sure, GLOB, it is from people in the parliament, mostly legislators. But for sure, when it is about how to implement things, mostly because of the NDCs, I am thinking that we must consider the different levels. Also, and this is my third comment, we the lawyers are used to thinking in the most formal concept of law. But if you talk with an economist or with many people here, probably they won't refer to law, they will refer to regulations, that it is a more economic concept. Because when it is law, for sure, we know how it is structured, what is the procedure, what does it mean, how much enforcement it is including, and all of those things. When it is about regulations, probably it is more related to how can we incentivize by some concrete rules because of a Ministry of Finance or because some other entity, how can we create a dynamic, an incentive to do. And I am pretty sure that we have to refer to that broader concept, law and regulations. Because even more, I am from Peru, so we are part of the Roman civil system. And when you go into the common law, when it is about regulators, it is a different concept. No? So it is also important to put the things clearly, graphically in our mind to know exactly what are we referring to. Then when it is about a law, there are always two options, or to promote and to incentivize, or to ban, to make something forbidden. And probably when it is about climate laws, we are talking about either, sometimes to promote, sometimes to ban. When it is about coal, probably what we are expecting it is to have a clarity on when exactly we are going to phase out coal and all the other fossil fuels. But when it is about carbon pricing, probably what we are going to do it is how can we use this instrument as a way to put some price to the carbon, as a way to incentivize some conduct and disincentivize some others. So also it is important to consider the options. A climate law can include both of them. But also this is about NDCs and long-term strategies, no? Because let me be clear, this is not just about NDCs. Also it is about how we must connect our NDCs with our long-term strategy. Because if you just have the NDC and you don't have the long-term strategy, the most potential consequence it is that you won't know exactly where to go. So that is why the importance of having a clear net zero and resilience long-term strategy as a way to know what is the role that the law can play today. And that is something that unfortunately it is missing in many, many countries. But also when it is about NDCs and long-term strategies, my point it is how much the law can contribute to make those instruments something that it is not just in hands of these tiny, and I used to be minister, but tiny ministries of the environment. Because unfortunately, friends, sometimes nobody cares about Ministry of the Environment. That is unfortunately the reality. How can we make the NDC and long-term strategy a strong domestic policy? That is the challenge. How can we make that policy something that will follow or will help us to follow some actions towards some objective? How can we make NDCs and long-term strategy something that it is related to one important concept, even for the law, competitiveness. Competitiveness, it is something so important in the domestic level, because we will always have discussions, debates, sometimes controversies in between the environmental side and the economic side. But if we are able to talk about competitiveness, I am pretty sure that we will be more able to engage each to other. So the point it is, how can we make those instruments so important for that? Because if it is not because of the law, it will be because of the judges, of the courts. And I don't remember, I think it was in Germany, when the court demanded the German government to increase ambition because of their NDC. So the courts are starting to have a very instrumental role when it is about of NDCs and long-term strategy. But also, and I don't want to take too much more time, when it is about law, it is not just about the climate law. The climate law, it is so important for sure, but there are many complements around that law. So when it is about climate, immediately jump or pop up from my mind, from my brain: forestry, fresh water, health, and many other instruments and laws that are extremely related to the climate debate and climate objective, and that we have to consider to organize a package of law, to try to transmit to our constituencies what it is about, how much we are considering all of that. And when it is about climate laws, please always remind it is not only about mitigation. Because mitigation, we know it is about energy, it is about circular economy, it is about energy efficiency, it is about sustainable cities. But what about vulnerability? How are we addressing vulnerability because of the law? The point it is that we do need to promote instruments that can help us to address the vulnerability of people. That is so, so important, because if not, we will recognize vulnerability just because of the news. Flood in a place, a drought in some other. No, the point it is how much we are well prepared because of our laws and regulation to be more preventive. Because, let me finish with this. In January 2024, Dubai suffered a big, big flood. And because of that flood, many electric vehicles were damaged. And because of that level of damage, the insurance company raised their price twice. And because of that, nobody wants to buy a new EV. Look how crazy this can be. So nobody is looking to buy an electric vehicle that it is a solution to face emissions because of a climate extreme event. So those are the kind of things that we have to consider when we are sitting in a parliament or when we are sitting in our cabinet discussing a law. It is how to promote incentive, how to consider the difficulties that we will have to face all of this complex ecosystem when it is about climate change. So I hope that I have brought some ideas for this discussion. As it has been mentioned, I have to run to some other very formal event, and that is why I am rushing. But thank you very much for this opportunity, and congratulations for WWF, Globe, Client Earth, for organizing this event, because sometimes we are forgetting the role of law, and sometimes we don't like too much lawyers, but we can play a key and instrumental role. So count on us that we are strongly working on that. I am working in environmental law for almost 40 years. This has been my topic, my main topic of my career, and I am sure that legislators, lawyers, and many others can be very instrumental to achieve our climate and biodiversity objective. Thank you very much.
Manuel, thank you so much. We understand you have to run, so thank you again. And at Client Earth, we love lawyers, so thank you. I don't know if you want to take a seat, Shirley, and then we can continue the discussion. So much rich, important words there from Manuel to inform our discussion now. Gizem, I'm gonna come to you first. Manuel talked about the need to build strong domestic policy. Can you please connect the dots for us between NDCs and framework climate laws?
Yes. Well, thank you, Amy, for this question. Actually, Manuel set the scene very well, so my job is now easier. The short answer to your question is that framework climate laws translate NDCs into clear, binding rules. Let's unwrap this one. Maybe I can start with defining what we understand when we say framework climate laws. These are basically the laws that set the framework of a state's climate change response. In that sense, they set the emission reduction targets and adaptation goals, or define very clear procedures and responsibilities for the setting of these targets and goals. They introduce planning mechanisms to achieve these targets and goals, put in place accountability mechanisms, be it political, administrative, judicial, and they establish new institutions such as the UK's Climate Change Committee, or repurpose the existing institutions such as South Africa's Presidential Climate Change Commission, so that climate policies are informed by the best available science, so that the government's progress against the climate targets are monitored adequately. There are about 60 of these laws around the world. We are calling for the next generation of framework climate laws, which fulfill all these governance functions that I just mentioned. And additionally, we want to see increased emphasis on adaptation, on the protection of biodiversity, more accurately, the nexus between climate change and the protection of biodiversity, and perhaps more detailed provisions on planning for access to climate finance. So, in a nutshell, framework climate laws provide enforceability of the pledges found in the NDCs. They define how the NDCs will be set, met, monitored, how to ensure stakeholder participation in their making and implementation, who in the government is responsible for setting those targets and meeting with those targets, how to ensure clarity, transparency and consistency of NDCs. In that sense, I can conclude by saying that framework climate laws represent a shift from voluntariness to commitments. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you, Gizem. Thank you very much. So we heard about the framework there. We also heard from Manuel about the role of Parliament. Marlene, can we come to you now to talk a little bit about the role of parliamentarians, both in establishing the law and then enacting it as well?
Thanks very much. I'm still getting used to this system of these silent mics and this headphone. And I'm wondering whether I should have taken off my headphone or left it on. Who knows? I've seen everybody else doing that. It works for me. So I assume you can hear me fine. So it's interesting listening to Manuel. Well, first of all, my name is Marlene Mhera, and I'm CEO of Globe Legislators. So we are an organization touching upon what Manuel has mentioned, which owes its origins to the Rio Earth Summit. Because you'll know, of course, that in most governments, most polities, you have three branches of governments, stating the obvious. You have the executive, who you see here. Most of them are coming from ministries of finance, ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of the environment, some ministries of finance. This is the government delegation. Then you've got the other branch of governments, who are the legislators. So we represent those lawmakers. And before Globe was founded in 1991, just ahead of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there was no platform for parliamentarians to engage in these intergovernmental conversations. So Globe was founded by people such as then Senators Al Gore and John Kerry, and their counterparts from other parliaments around the world. So we have grown over the time, over this one generation. Yeah, it's been more than 30 years. And we are now the focal point within the UNFCCC for parliamentary organizations and networks. Because what we've found is that since 2015, there has been an absolute explosion of various different parliamentary groups and networks, because they realized that the Paris Agreement meant that you had to have laws and policies in place. And who makes those laws in particular? Those are legislators. So we come full circle. But just going back, so you have an appreciation of the landscape that we're talking about in terms of climate legislation. So at the time of Kyoto, going back to COP3 in 1997, there were around about 54 pieces of legislation around the world on environment, forests, water, that had an energy component and could be classified as climate change laws and policies. So fast forward to the time of Paris, and that had gone up to 3,000. Now we have many, many more, and there's a brilliant website which is based on Globe's work called the Climate Change Laws of the World. It's hosted by the London School of Economics, and you can see in real time how that body, that international architecture of climate legislation is being added to as we speak. There will be more coming out of it as a result of COP29. So what is the connection between the NDCs and this body of climate change legislation? Well, the first and very obvious one is that this NDC 3.0 is substantively very different to what we've had before. We have the NDCs because we've got this ratchet mechanism in the Paris Agreement, which gives us the gift of the global stocktake, which is that after every 5 years, you review where you are, and then you reflect on what the outcomes are of that global stocktake, and basically it's told us we're not moving fast enough. We don't have all sectors of our economy involved in a decarbonization transition. And so we have this next generation of NDCs, the NDCs 3.0, which are hugely ambitious, hugely demanding in terms of the intellectual, the administrative effort that's going to have to go into understanding and analyzing which sectors of every single economy are going to be impacted by the Paris Agreement and by the existing commitments that that government has made for decarbonization. And I can tell you very few governments are prepared for that because they really have not paid attention to the fact that this is real economy-wide, and you're going to have economic transition plans, which means economic investment plans for every sector. And it could be pharmaceuticals, it could be agriculture, it could be construction. It's not just about energy. That's the big challenge. So what does that mean for what we're talking about here, the FLS, the Framework Climate Laws, FCL? Yes? I keep thinking CFL, FCL. CFL, compact fluorescent? Okay, inside the joke. So what that means is that we cannot continue to have a very chaotic combination, which is different in every country, of climate change legislation, which doesn't connect really very well with what other parts of the intergovernmental system are throwing at us, right? Because the NDCs people think are about decarbonization, emissions reductions, mitigation. But actually, from the very beginning, they were conceived as national climate plans, which included adaptation. But adaptation has been the stepsister, of mitigation. And adaptation without resilience means that you are always going to be extremely vulnerable to the climate impacts. So you see what the level of complexity is. We need to have plans which bring together mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Now on top of that, we've got the devilish partnership between nature and climate, because now we have to bring in, as a result of all of the advocacy, to bring climate and nature together, which is one of the reasons we're partnering with WWF, is because you've got to have the national biodiversity frameworks also brought in. And then, of course, in order to protect yourself from creating more risk, we've got the Sendai framework, which we have a partnership at Globe with that bit of the UN, the UNDRR, that works on risk governance. They've got the Sendai framework, which sets out what countries need to do to manage and reduce their risks. So you can see all of these agendas and processes are clamoring for attention in national plans, laws, policies, and measures. And that's why we need the framework climate legislation, because this is a new generation of climate legislation which will be comprehensive. And it will require a huge amount of education and capacity building amongst parliaments. We can't do it alone, which is why we want to team up with the World Commission on Environmental Law, with the World Commission of Jurists, who have been our partners in the past. So we bring the lawmakers together with the judges. Because of work of organizations like Client Earth, we now have a body of litigation which is showing us where the climate change laws are deficit. So lawmakers have to learn from what's passing through the courts, because they're showing us where laws are not fit for purpose, where government commitments are failing. So this is all part and parcel of this lovely, wonderful job we're going to do together fantastically well for creating the next generation of framework climate legislation.
Thank you, Marlene. And I mean, you gave such a comprehensive overview there in terms of the depth of work that's needed, but also the depth of collaboration that's needed as well, and that we can't do it alone. Certainly parliamentarians and ourselves can't do it alone. And I'd like to bring in Annabella here to talk a little bit about the civil society piece. So what's the role of civil society in this effort, Annabella?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to Client Earth to with WWF and being in the Panda Pavilion yet again. It's always a pleasure. So we will not be discussing here about climate laws if civil society had not massively mobilized to get those there. I mean, like, there's no, secret here. I mean, we do know that it's public pressure that what takes governments also into responding through laws and regulations and different other tools to the climate crisis. Of course, they are responding to a UN regime that is evolving more and more, but that UN regime, it's also, the consequence, I would say, part at least, of the mobilization of thousands of organizations and millions of people behind to call for more ambition and to call for that to be translated into their real lives. Because that's also, I guess, what climate policy is about. I was trying to think, and clearly I'm not the lawyer in the panel. I mean, my background is on political science and economy, so it's about power. It's less about law. I mean, law is still a reflection of a certain power balance in society. And I think it's very important when we're thinking about how we build strong, ambitious climate laws, as well as how we're thinking here about the international regime affecting them, like in the case of the NDCs. What is the power balance that is taking us into those laws, and therefore how far we can go in terms of our 1.5 destination, and also, and I guess it's the heart of my work, how we ensure that that pathway also embraces justice towards people, towards communities, enhances rights, so that we are not just reproducing, basically, with probably numbers in a paper, the injustices that we know are making today people being elected that we don't necessarily like, pathways for policy that are really at odds with everything we care about, certainly all of those that are here in this space today. So I'm not been working, just to be very clear, a lot on domestic climate laws, but many people in the Climate Action Network are, including all of you as members of our network. And I think what is very clear is that there are at least 3 areas in which civil society is working hard to make them happen. One, of course, as I said, is the push for ambition. There's no point in only having climate laws, but climate laws that are not meeting the level of ambition that we need. And I think in that push and pull that we need to have with all levels of governments, I agree that it's not only with the executive, and actually there have been fascinating conversations between parliaments and people about climate laws, because it's a critical part of that democratic conversation that needs to occur in countries. That pathway to ambition is very much given by the tone, the engagement, and sometimes the very difficult, hard technical work, but sometimes supplied also by many people coming from civil society. I think there is a second part that we might pay less attention to, that I think is also critical for building power and, again, getting better outcomes, which is the governance and the build-up of these climate laws. How do we get to them? What are the consultation mechanisms that are built up to get people's input? Of course, climate laws have been extremely interesting, and this has already been raised, in creating new governance mechanisms. So, different groups of experts, different ways of managing the law when it has been agreed. But I also think, like, having as an objective a climate law has also provided a pathway for many constituencies in our countries to engage with this concept, enrich the conversation, and also somehow feel that they have something to contribute to climate action. And this has been the case, in many countries. You mentioned the case of the UK. We can think about France with the whole, Assemblée Citoyenne, but also, in other contexts, like in other political moments in my own country, in Argentina, you can have, I worked 15 years for the trade union movement. It's quite incredible to see why, when you have a table that is starting to discuss a climate law, suddenly you start seeing also farmer organizations coming, trade unions coming, women organizations coming. And that is a critical part in changing that power balance, because the more we have public demand for that action, the likelier we are to get a more ambitious outcome at the end. And of course, pushing for the right kind of governance so that these commitments are following through. And I think there is a third element, and there is probably when I'm the most wobbly in terms of my own expertise, but that clearly, I mean, we are pushing hard for, which is how we build, through the different experiences of litigation as well, a new climate regime that is much more reflective, at least of some of the justice elements and that we have been seeking for. Certainly in the just transition conversation that we can discuss a little bit later on, that I'm working on, the ability of domestic climate law and the kind of conversations that we are having here at the international level about how that affects NDCs is one of the pathways also for strengthening climate justice provisions in many of those laws in a loop that is self-reinforcing. Because we have good examples coming from the ground, feeding into the international conversation, feeding then hopefully the 3.0 guidance of the NDCs, and therefore trying to make a much different pathway to climate action than the one that we have until now, that is not only not ambitious enough from an emissions perspective, but also not yet delivering on what many people and communities are expecting out there as what we would consider just climate policies.
Annabella, thank you very much. You touched on something very interesting there as well, which is the fact that framework climate laws, when they are consulted and enacted, they can really bring the topic into the public agenda, right? So it's very interesting because oftentimes framework climate laws can have a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. I think bottom-up we've seen recently in the South Africa example a few months ago. Top-down, I think, if I'm not wrong, Gizem will correct me, but the 2008 Environment Act in the UK, which is one of the oldest framework climate laws. So you've heard the why in terms of NDCs. You've heard the what in terms of framework climate laws. You've heard the how, the role of parliamentarians and civil society. I want to touch on a couple more questions with the panel. I'll ask the panel to be as brief as possible so that we can go to the audience for questions. But Gizem, can I come back to you first and ask you, I know Client Earth's done, I know because I work there, Client Earth's done quite a bit of work recently looking at recent judgments and how they inform our approach to framework climate laws. Can you touch on these briefly and also talk about how framework climate laws can help meet obligations or human rights obligations specifically?
Thank you, Amy. Litigation have been mentioned quite a few times, so I'm happy to clarify these points. The recent decisions by courts signal a shift in how we perceive climate legislation. The first example is the European Court of Human Rights judgment of this April, in the case of Klima Seniorin and Schweiz and others versus Switzerland. In this case, ECHR held that Switzerland had breached its positive obligations under the convention because it failed to put in place and implement an adequate legislative framework to tackle climate change. This failure had led to the violation of Article 8 of the Convention, which guaranteed the right to private and family life. In the court's judgment, by the way, it was the Grand Chamber of the court who delivered this decision. There are important conclusions in this judgment as to how we can legislate climate change. So according to the court, the states have to establish a binding legislative framework on climate change first and foremost and implement this legislative framework. They need to set intermediate-term emission reduction targets, quantify greenhouse gas emission limitations through carbon budgets or other means, update emission reduction targets according to best available science, take adaptation measures, ensure public participation and access to information in the climate policy landscape. These are the very functions of the framework climate laws as we spoke. It is also important to note that this judgment comes against the backdrop of a high number of domestic court judgments in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in many other countries, which confirmed that a state's failure or insufficiency to act on climate change constituted violations of human rights. For example, more specifically on adaptation, there was the Client Earth supported case of the Torres Strait Islanders, Daniel Billy and others versus Australia, where the Human Rights Committee had concluded that Australia's failure to take adaptation measures had breached the convention. A second recent development we can touch upon, so the Framework Climate Law's role is not only to integrate human rights law into the climate change policy, but they also integrate other fields of law into the policy landscape. So the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas advisory opinion, which was delivered this year again in May, is an important example in that regard. So the tribunal concluded that the greenhouse gas emissions absorbed by the oceans constitute marine pollution within the meaning of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So therefore, the tribunal said the states must reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For that purpose, they need to put in place national legislation, administrative structures that are adequate for tackling climate change. In our advocacy, of course, we are trying to integrate these important conclusions by the courts into the texts of the next generation framework climate laws. One final point to make is that we are also advocating that the climate policies must be aligned with the state obligations stemming from both domestic and international guarantees of human rights. So in that sense, framework climate laws play an important role too. Thank you.
I'll use this. This is good, yeah. Thanks. I want to make 3 points.
Go ahead.
The first is about the formation of laws, yeah? Because we talked briefly earlier about bottom-up, top-down lawmaking. Fundamentally, the best laws that are made are always cross-party, and they involve consultation. So to the point that you made. And the gold standard law is the UK's Climate Change Act of 2008. And I have to correct the origin story of this. The 2008 Climate Change Act came about because of campaigning by Friends of the Earth. And I used to work for Friends of the Earth International and actually led the engagement of Friends of the Earth International at Kyoto. And at that time, in the late 1990s, and of course 1997 when we had Kyoto, it was evident to us that because of resistance from parties such as the US, we weren't going to get legally binding legislation. We weren't going to get legally binding commitments, because you don't make laws at this level, you make commitments. And then those commitments have to go back into parliaments. This is what the ideal situation is. Any party to a treaty then has to go back to its parliament and explain to parliament what has just happened. And then parliament can take the decision whether these should be voluntary or whether these should be transcribed into national legislation. And that's what happened in the UK, where you had a campaign which ran for a number of years, and the culmination of that was the Climate Change Act. And actually Bryony Worthington, who used to work for Friends of the Earth, was then elevated to the House of Lords and became Baroness Bryony Worthington. And if we look at most recently, I mean, this lesson, we now have a very long time, almost 20 years, to reflect on the lessons about what makes good, robust, sturdy laws which can withstand the polarizing effects of political administrations being changed. Yeah? And we know that that consensus building occurs when you commit to engagement with a variety of stakeholders. So civil society is extremely important, but it's not the only one. Yeah, there are many others, professional organizations, business organizations, employers and others who are going to be expected to pay for these. So that's a really, really important point. The second point is about net zero. Because net zero commitments now cover almost 100% of the global economy, frankly. If you don't have net zero commitments in your own national legislation, your businesses will still be affected by it because of where they are in the supply chain of others. So I'm thinking of European Commission and CBAMs, okay? So those net zero commitments are actually a part and parcel of the climate legislation that we're seeing in many countries. So when we talk about the next generation of NDCs 3.0, please bear in mind it is about the implementation of the NDCs, of the net zero commitments. And I've forgotten my third point, but I'm sure it'll come up at some point.
Yeah.
I'll leave that now because those are the two main ones to make.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you. And yeah, if you remember your third point, give me a heads up, and I'll. But I'd like to come to Shirley now. We've talked about the sort of text of framework climate laws. What important elements of NDCs 3.0 should be incorporated into these framework climate laws?
Thanks, Amy. And that was a wonderful segue, actually. I wanted to talk a little bit about what NDCs 3.0 are, and I think that Malini already touched on that. These are pledges and promises on what countries are going to do, and Manuel picked up on that as well. We have NDCs, we have long-term strategies, and we have countries saying this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to get to net zero. We've been working on this for a number of years. If you follow the QR code here, you will see our checklist, which sets out what our benchmarks are for NDCs. But like Malini says, we also need to think about how we're going to implement these and what is the right way to go about this discussion. We've been through the first cycle of NDCs. We've been thinking about what implementation looks like and what is it that we can do to really kind of push this forward. And I think there's a couple of really key things to keep in mind. The fact that we're looking for progression, but we want to maintain this nationally determined sort of element within this regime. And it's been really important hearing it in the rooms here. So I think that's really important to remember that, you know, how do we support this bottom up? We talked a little bit about this, cross-cutting, make this a national conversation, linking it appropriate to the international regime. And I think this is where the framework climate laws come in. I'm also not a lawyer, but I've been working on this with, I think, this partnership. You can tell we're all very much aligned in our thinking, which is really, I mean, I'm finding it very inspiring to be around this group of women, actually, I think I will just acknowledge. But also working on what's happening in ICJ around the links to human rights. So I think there's an element of progression that really needs to be reflected in the NDCs 3.0. There's pledges that are being made, they're being strengthened. How can we create this at the national level? How can we have this discussion and make sure that there's a consistency? And I think that's also relevant. I mean, half of the world population went to the polls this year. We've seen shifts in what's happening politically. How can we maintain this consistency in this geopolitical environment that we're in? And I think we all know what's happening, what's happening here and some of the concerns that have come out on that. So I think this is a really important discussion. And I've been really inspired about hearing about some of the role that the parliamentarians can have and civil society can have in really pushing forward, really supporting this agenda. So I think that's really important. And did I have another point? That's a good question. Yeah, I think there's also an element of making sure that we have urgency and response. And I want to come back to something that Manuel said about how certainly making sure that we are pushing forward the NDCs and the long-term strategies. We also need to think about what needs to be happening right now. And I think that's why I think this is a really good time to have this discussion on next generation NDCs. Over the next year, countries are really developing their NDCs, they're submitting them, but we really have this short window in order to keep 1.5 alive. And one of the really important messages that I really want to repeat as much as possible is that we need to address our pre-30 ambition if we're going to keep cost-effective pathways alive. And I think that goes back to all the conversations about rights of people, rights of those most vulnerable, those who are being impacted by climate change. We need that consistency and implementation at the national level. So I think that's why I want to say that this is a really timely time to have this discussion alongside the development of NDCs 3.0. Thanks.
Super, Shelley. Can I just bring, Marlene, can I bring Annabella back in, and then we'll come to you, and then I want to come to the audience as well. So if you've got a question, get ready. Okay, Marlene, do you want to go ahead?
I've actually remembered my third point.
Okay, let's hear
Yes.
it.
and it is again is to illustrate the innovations which are taking place, because it's not quite correct to say that it's just lawmakers who make laws. It is also judges, and that is very, very controversial. I remember in Paris we brought together as Globe for the first time, we brought legislators together in a conversation with judges, members of Supreme Courts from different countries around the world. And this is important to reflect back to you, because you've got Client Earth and your focus is on litigation. What comes out of the pipeline are judgments. And those judgments create case law. And that's very important, because that case law then informs the body of laws. So we can't have this discussion without considering what's happening within the judiciary. Because in some parts of the world, and I would make the claim that the most innovative judicial engagement on climate change and climate justice is happening in one country. And it's not the ones that you think of. It's happening in Pakistan. And it's happening in Pakistan because you have got extremely visionary judges and environmental lawyers who have formed a community of practice. And their practice is committed to implementing the promises of their constitution. And the constitution is fundamental when we're talking about this, because every lawmaker, every judge has to enforce, it's their duty to enforce the terms of the constitution. And so these judges in Pakistan, and it started from the Lahore High Court, which is in Punjab, which is the state that I come from, and they took on some very, cases that came before them. They were not well publicized. Nobody knows them. You know the Heathrow case, you know the Urkhanda case, etc. But they have had such a dramatic impact because of the creative way in which the jurists have used international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And what they've basically done is they have brought these documents from the international sphere and aligned them with their constitution and said, we can make these rulings even if we don't have the body of legislation, but we are relying on the international conventions, and we are now referencing them, so we are giving them much greater authority in our judicial system. And I'll give you one example which is very, very live right now, and then I'm going to hand over. So one of those judges who was an environmental lawyer, he became a judge, Javed Mia. He's taken on board a case from a 3-year-old girl in Pakistan called Amal. Now, the first question that they had to answer was, does she even have legal standing? She's 3 years old, and she's never left her house. She's not able to go to school because it's so polluted where she lives that her parents are keeping her indoors. So he took this on because he said, this is a catastrophic violation of your right. Every right which is there in Pakistan's constitution, the right to a healthy environment, you are being deprived of. And so the first question was, does she have legal standing? Because according to Pakistan's legal system, you are only a person from the age of 5. And below that, you're a child. And the child has no legal standing. So I'm just illustrating this just to show you how dynamic this field is, where we have that interplay between international commitments, whatever comes out of here, but the fact that you have jurists, not civil society organizations, but they are initiators. They are every bit as activist as somebody who's protesting in the street. But they're using their cleverness, their professional background to create a new body of laws and new concepts which will drive us further.
Thank you, Marlene. Great point. And also gives me the opportunity to just mention a little bit about Client Earth's work as well. We're very well known for our strategic litigation, which Marlene mentioned, but we also develop laws, we write laws. We helped craft the draft Poland climate law, and we train judges and lawyers in different countries as well. So that's part and parcel of our rule of law approach. Annabella, I wanted to come to you about just transition. We've heard quite a bit about rights and responsibilities from the panel. What kind of rights and responsibilities need to be enshrined in framework climate laws in order to enable a just transition?
Thank you, Amy. And yeah, I would say a word about that, but I would also like to react a little bit to what was said before. So on the just transition is relatively simple, and at the same time is super complex, because we're talking here about prosperity pathways. I mean, this is also what the NDCs and all these different climate trajectories are about, so the long-term strategies, etc. It's about how we figure out a much better alignment between prosperity, life and dignity, rights in different countries, the economic ability of countries to provide for their citizens, and a climate trajectory that is compatible with the commitments that countries have adopted internationally. And doing so is, on the one side, simple. I think we have the rights infrastructure to know what we need to deliver. I mean, like, many of those things exist already. We do know. I mean, like, of course, human rights and labor rights and the right to a clean environment needs to be absolutely embedded in it. Indigenous people's rights, consultation and free, prior, informed consent. We also know that there are some economic elements like social protection. I mean, how we protect the income, I mean, for example, of people that might be impacted by climate policies and by climate impacts. How we ensure that those are seen as part of climate policy as well. Economic diversification. I mean, again, I mean, this is when the whole industrial policy and economic policy intersects with law. What Manuel was saying at the beginning, this is not only about law, this is also about regulation, and this is also about figuring out a balance between different needs in countries. So all of those pieces find a place and should find a home in the next iteration of NDCs. That's what we are working hard also here in the conversation about Just Transition Work Program, where there has been already discussions about how we bring this in a more coherent way into the NDCs. But there, where I would like to just end and reflecting a little bit more on what the panel was saying, is that there are also different theories of change, and let's be clear about this, about what even within civil society. I mean, civil society is by no means monolithic. I mean, like, we all are coming with a different understanding of what society needs to be behind climate ambition. And clearly, from probably my personal background, and certainly where the Climate Action Network is on as well, is that on top of civil society finding balance and articulating this with other actors that were mentioned before, I think we also need to be much more serious and sincere in listening to people. I don't think climate ambition will survive by technical tricks happening in law and through judges. I mean, we need also public support for the climate trajectory that we need to take. And for that, we need climate policy to stop being so techno-oriented, so business-friendly sometimes, to really think about what people need and who pays. And you said this, who pays? I mean, and say, well, that was one of the reasons to involve certainly the private sector in the conversation. Absolutely. But not as a means to make them not pay. Because right now, who is paying for climate action is either because of the lack of action or because of the kind of action is working people. I mean, are the ones that have the least, when we know that the wealthiest, the ones that have the most, are doing nothing to get us out of this. So I just also wanted to bring a little bit of probably a plea for all of those that are working in the legal space not to forget that law is also a reflection of the power balance in which we are. And we need to change that so that we can get the ambition that we need. We are not going to survive this flow of populism, anti-climate populism that is emerging everywhere. We might retain a little bit of it. We might manage to keep it safe for a little while. In the end, we need to do the hard work of organizing people and convincing and organizing so that we can change the balance and get the kind of trajectory that we need.
Thank you, Annabella. We have 3 minutes left. So if someone has a very quick question, then let's hear it. The man put his hand up in the back quicker, but if we have another minute, I'll come back to you. But let's hear the question from the back.
Yeah, thank you. Our own experience in Mexico, we are one of the original countries that had its climate law, and it's been like 12, 13 years ago. And we are working on a new climate law, this new generation. So I know it's very general and each country is different, but what would you say, any of you who want to answer, would a new generation climate law should have? What is the must? No, I mean, it's general, but maybe a few points that you, in your experience, can share with us.
Thank you, thank you. I think, Gizem, if you can do it in one or two sentences, that would be great.
Sure. As I mentioned before, most of the first generation laws, and I think Mexico's law is in that category as well, were drafted with mitigation in mind, with an increased focus on mitigation. And Malini was right in pointing out that adaptation was seen as the stepsister. Yes. So in that sense, yes, adaptation planning processes could be defined in more detail. This is not specific to the Mexico's climate law. I am not exactly an expert on Mexico's climate law, so please take this with the necessary grain of salt. But the increased recognition of the nexus between biodiversity protection and climate action is very important also, and those are usually considered in the context of adaptation. For example, prioritization of nature-based solutions. Most framework climate laws are expected to define this concept and how set some principles as to how to operationalize this concept in the legal system. Again, the planning processes, the alignment between the planning processes for biodiversity protection and adaptation, these might be important points to consider while drafting climate change law. Another point might be to increase access to climate finance and to ensure that the resources are allocated for the right purposes. The framework climate laws could foresee financial planning mechanisms, risk reporting by companies, and so on. So the finance aspects could be developed in comparison to the first generation of laws.
Thank you. We have to end now, otherwise they will cut us off. Sorry, Jen. Please grab someone afterwards, after we're finished. 2 words, please, from everybody. What do we need to see in the next 6 months, in your opinion? 2 words, only 2 words, please. Shirley.
Oh my goodness, 2 words. 3 words. NDC implementation plans. There we go.
I would say integrating human rights obligations of states into climate policy, integrating biodiversity protection into climate policy, but this is in no way comprehensive, of course.
Yeah, if I had 3 words, I would say, first of all, transparency, second, coherence, and third, accountability.
Just transition.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. I hope you enjoyed this rich discussion. So what do we need? Framework climate laws. When do we need them? Now. Thank you.